Hi, everyone. We have about 30 seconds till we get started. So if you're here for ecological forestry in the context of climate change, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to talk about national trends in forest disturbances. And since that's a spooky topic, today's the right day to talk about it. And we're going to be hearing from Dr. Jen Costanza in just a minute. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Gwyneth Dalton from National Conservation Training Center, and she's going to get us started. Thanks for joining us today. Go ahead, Gwen.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Dalton, and today's webinar is titled The National Trends in Forest Disturbances by Jen Costanza. And we are very excited to have Jen here with us, who is from USDA Forest Service at the Southern Research Station. We will be introducing Jen in just a moment, but I would first like to remind you of a few pre-webinar items. I would like to start this week's webinar with the NCTC land acknowledgement. The National Conservation Training Center is located on ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples. These include, but are not limited to, the Massawomack, Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. NCTC is dedicated to building relationships with Indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn more about the land that they reside on. I'm happy to share a link to those who are interested on where you can learn more about the inhabitants of the land that you live and work at. I would also like to mention that here at NCTC, we welcome all students. It is my intention to create a safe and inclusive and productive webinar environment that honors and supports diverse ideas. We are strengthened by diverse perspectives and identities, and we will foster the environment where everyone can learn new skills. As such, I will be an ally in this event, and if anyone feels experiences of issues or feels unwelcome, please reach out to me and let me know, and I will help to the best of my ability. Also, a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the material and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted of use. Mentions of any products, names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. I'd also like to let you know that this webinar is indeed being recorded and all participants have been muted and will remain that way during the webinar. But that does not mean that we don't want you to participate. There is a chat setting which you can chat to everyone, and you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. I encourage you to do so. And so we can get an idea of who is attending the webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat setting. And so you can submit questions by going down into the chat and make sure to have the chat open to everyone so we can all see who you are and the questions that you have for both the panelists and me. Lastly, if you want to view all of the speakers, you can go to view, which is the little squares, and you can put it on side-by-side gallery, and that'll help you have the best viewing situation for this webinar. Now I'm going to turn it over to our host, Jeff, to tell us a little bit more about this series, as well as introduce our lovely speaker today. Take it away, Jeff.
Thanks, Gwyneth. So you guys are viewing, this is sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group, also Fish and Wildlife Service Science Applications and the Migratory Birds Program, along with the National Conservation Training Center, who is really hosting the series for us. But we have also been joined throughout the last couple series that we've done by the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, that's NIACS, and the USDA Forest Service, in sponsoring this webinar series. So it has been great fun to work with folks at NIACS and the Forest Service in doing this. And so Fish and Wildlife Service really appreciates that. You see there's some contact information here. Our Forest Ecology Working Group contact is Lindsay Grayson. I'm one of your series hosts. And then you see Gwyneth's handling the technical stuff, and Jim Siegel. You can email Jim if you need Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters credits. Next slide when you get a chance, Gwyneth. So if many of you have been participants in our webinars in the past, and so this webinar series is similar in that it's a 12-part monthly webinar series. We basically try to tell a story at both the small and large scale. In this case, we're talking about disturbance such as fire, wind, ice storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, and also introducing endemic forest pests and how these are impacting our forest ecosystems. This particular series is also going to examine ecological silviculture and climate adaptation approaches to help inform forest and wildlife habitat management. So that's the 12-part series. We're still up at the larger context today, and we're going to hear from Jennifer related to these bigger national trends of forest disturbance, kind of at the national level. And just to give a quick commercial for our next, our webinar 3, and this is going to be on November 21st, and we're really fortunate to have Christina Eisenberg from Oregon State University, and she's going to be talking about synergistic effects of multiple stressors on forest resistance, resilience, and response. And again, there's usually not just one stressor, it's when these things combine. So that's what we're talking about. And next, almost time to introduce Jen so we can get to the heart of today's webinar. And there she is. So Jen Costanza is a research ecologist with USDA Forest Service at the Southern Research Station and Center for Integrated Forest Science. Jen received her PhD in ecology from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has a master in environmental management and resource ecology from Duke and a BS in biology from Indiana University. She's worked for the Forest Service since 2020, and prior to that, she was a member of the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at NC State. So Dr. Costanza's research, and she won't let me call her Dr. Costanza, but Jen's research focuses on understanding how forests and landscapes have changed in the past and the ways in which it may change in the future. Her recent and ongoing work includes quantifying the effects of climate and land use change on forest disturbance and modeling forest dynamics in response to changing disturbance and management. And Jen was part of the recently released Forest Resource Assessment. And so we're really fortunate to have her. Thanks so much for being part of the series, Jen, and looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Let me share my screen.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop.
Okay. All right, can you all see that as a full screen slide? All look good. I'll assume it does.
Yes, very good.
Okay, awesome.
It does. Hey, Jen, I forgot to say one thing, and that is that we're gonna take questions about halfway through, and we'll also take questions at the end. So folks can start, if you have questions, you can start putting them in the chat at any time, and we'll capture a couple of them about halfway through, and then we'll take as many as we can later. Thank you. Sorry to forget that.
Okay, great, Jeff. And if I start plowing through halfway, please jump in and remind me if I forget. I'm just so excited to talk to you all about disturbance. So yeah, as Jeff said, I'm here to talk about sort of national level trends in forest disturbance, both sort of in the recent past and then some future trends in response to climate and socioeconomic scenarios. Let's see. So first, before I start, I just want to acknowledge some of my Forest Service colleagues who have contributed some of the content here. As Jeff mentioned, a lot of this is from this 2020 Resources Planning Act assessment that we have. And so lots of people contributed to that. So here are the folks whose content I'm using here today. So lots of folks to thank. So today, kind of the structure of my talk, I'm going to start with a brief few slides about just kind of setting the stage about why we should care about forest disturbances, mainly at a pretty broad level. And then the meat of my talk, most of the slides will focus on this middle piece, which is that RPA assessment that I mentioned. So giving an overview of recent trends and future projections of some disturbances we put together for this 2020 RPA assessment, which was recently released despite the 2020 was released this past summer, 2023. So it's pretty hot off the presses, and I'm excited to share with you. And then just to wrap up with some additional thoughts, some sort of management implications and why we do this sort of assessment and some future work we're moving toward. So to start, this kind of why should we care? So it might not come as a surprise to most of you, but just to remind us that disturbances are part of the natural dynamics of forests. Many disturbance events occur with some frequency and magnitude in all, or if not nearly all, if not all forests. This can include things like fire, drought, insects and disease. Jeff mentioned even more. Like hurricanes and storms and wind and et cetera. And so we see in the news, if you've seen, the last few years, especially big wildfires, for example, droughts in the West, et cetera. And as climate and land use change, disturbance regimes are being altered. We have the possibility of many disturbance types being either more frequent, severe, or longer in duration in the future. So we wanted to take a look at that in a comprehensive way in this national assessment of disturbance within the RPA assessment, and start to get a handle on some of the recent trends and future projections. So I'm going to show that, like I said, but first, just some broad overview slides to kind of put this in context. So these first few slides are from the USDA Forest Service's Climate Risk Viewer, which you can find online if you Google that. But this is just a picture of places where bark beetle mortality has occurred over the past 2 decades. So pretty widespread in some places, but also kind of confined to certain regions of the West, but still over this 20-year period, lots of forests at least being exposed to mortality. Wildfire, again, as I mentioned, we hear a lot about wildfire. So these are places where wildfire has occurred over the past 20 years or so. So again, kind of in all regions, but especially out West, some in the South, but they kind of touch a lot of the country. And then here's another metric from this Climate Risk Viewer, places where there has been repeat drought exposure at different percent of the time. And so again, a lot of exposure to drought out West, even in the East. We hear maybe a lot about it in California and other places, but certainly drought occurs kind of everywhere in the country. And so it really brings to light the kind of need to dig in deeper to some of these trends, think about how they might affect the forests, et cetera. And so those were kind of recent past just snapshots. And I'll go into those trends, at least in the wildfire and drought pieces in a lot more detail. But, those are some recent picture of some of the disturbances. But when we think about disturbance, we think about maybe some increases in disturbance over time and then into the future, also increasing climate extremes that might affect forests and other ecosystems, kind of overlaid with this climate change, long-term kind of, if you will, press disturbance, sort of long-term, slow, gradual change in climate. And forest ecosystems might be pretty resilient or resistant to some of those disturbances or extremes at first, but then when the kind of long-term trend becomes greater and greater increase or change over time, over once they're exposed to these sort of multiple drivers, they can lead over time to declining resistance and resilience in these ecosystems. And so this is just one kind of reason why, or one example, or one kind of illustration of how climate can interact with these disturbances and climate change, and why we should care about changing disturbance regimes. And some examples of where this has kind of come to light. This is some places where drought has occurred, and sort of high severity drought, and in some cases in combination with great increase in heat stress. And these are just satellite kind of based indices of change in greenness. So you can see kind of the footprint on the left of drought in California back in 2014, showing widespread. This brown is kind of decreased, vegetation or greenness. And then in Texas too, there was a widespread drought. And shortly after that, showing in the reds, decreased greenness. So we can start to see some of the spatial footprint of in this case, drought on forests and other ecosystems. And it remains to be seen. This could indicate kind of a stress on these forests, and maybe they're not greening with the same greenness as they would have in the past, just temporarily, or in some places these droughts did lead to mortality within these footprints. So a wide range of effects of some of these disturbances, which is another illustration of why we should care. And so on this slide, I have another kind of example here of sort of how climate change and changing disturbances can lead to effects. And here's my one kind of shout out to Halloween here, but I'll get to that. So this is a study of many sites out west over several states, in moister forests and then in dry forests. And these are places where fires had burned since 1988 to 2011 in these conifer forests. And the authors of the study went back and looked at the regeneration on these sites, and they kind of controlled for kind of expected regeneration times, and all the kind of sampling occurred, and these measurements occurred sort of after you would expect some regeneration to occur, seedlings. And so fires prior to 2000, we see, so the black bars are the proportion of sites where no conifer seedlings were present following fire when they resampled. I think it was in the mid 2010s. So, about 30% of dry sites and about maybe 5 to 10% of moist sites had no conifer seedlings present when fires, in sites where fires occurred prior to 2000. Now, after 2000 in these sites, the climate got a lot drier. And so we see an increase in places where there was no regeneration following fire. And the dry sites had more of an increase than the moist sites, but you see this interaction between the moisture regime and the occurrence of fire here. So, and it remains to be seen kind of what will happen to these forests. I have, rest in peace forest ? Some of these forests may not return ever, perhaps. Perhaps there'll be changed composition, a different type of forest ecosystem, or perhaps management will help facilitate kind of regeneration of, either the old forests or old species composition or new species. And then here's another example of a kind of, in the worst case, we see some disturbances really triggering transformations in ecosystems. We see this is actually a paper in review right now, and Shelley Crosby was kind enough to let me show it. They put together a bunch of case studies of where drought had triggered transformations. These are actual documented ecosystem transformations following drought. So one in Alaska, black spruce forest transforming. One that's not a forest example, but in the southeast in Georgia, loss of salt marsh vegetation due to drought, and then some transformation from pine forest to oak woodlands in Europe. And so just a few examples, we may have failure to regenerate, kind of as I showed on the previous slide, and then, in the worst case, leading to these transformations or kind of tipping points, if you will, where the old ecosystem does not and cannot come back in the future. And so those were just some really quick, that was just a really quick overview of kind of some of the broad picture of some of the disturbances we're seeing, we have in this in the conterminous US, and then why we should care. So for example, we can get reductions in tree growth or productivity, kind of stress, which might be captured in that drought image, or the 2 drought images I showed with the vegetation anomalies, also mortality, temporary loss of forest cover, regeneration failure, and then again, transformation to new forest ecosystems or even non-forest. So again, disturbances are part of the natural dynamics of ecosystems, that they are changing, and they can combine with climate change to alter ecosystems. So that's kind of why we care about disturbance. And so now, kind of with that in mind, we'll jump into these results from the RPA assessment. And again, they're looking at pretty broad trends like we have been across regions and nationally, but I hope to set the stage for future talks here. And it's also really nice to see some of the next talks coming up really related to this topic. And so just some background on the RPA assessment. It's mandated by Congress to be done on a decadal sort of time step, and it's been done since the 1970s. And in the 1990s, there was an amendment to the Act of Congress that said we have to incorporate the effects of climate change. So this work has a long history, and the latest one was released this summer. Like I said, we look at broad sort of regional to national trends in forests and forest resources. We look across all lands, all forests, and then rangelands as well. And then we even have a chapter where we look at all lands, all land uses, where we look at the recent past, and then we go 50 years into the future, so to 2070 in this case. And we look at climate and socioeconomic scenarios. And you can find a bunch of resources related to the RPA and the RPA chapters themselves at this link. And I'd be happy to share it later with folks if you can't scratch it down right now, but just search for RPA and you'll probably find it, Forest Service RPA. So some of the resources evaluated in the RPA assessment, again, we kind of touch on a bunch of different aspects of forest resources. We look at trends in the forests themselves and forest products and rangelands, land resources, so land use, disturbance, which is what I'll mainly focus on today, or this disturbance chapter per se in the RPA, water resources, outdoor recreation, and wildlife and biodiversity. So I will focus on the disturbance chapter, but then I will show a couple of results from other chapters after that to kind of put some of the disturbance trends into context a little bit. So in RPA disturbance, this is actually the first time we've sort of had a focus on disturbance in the RPA. I said RPA has been around for a long time, but this 2020 is the first time when these trends have been kind of assembled and been a focus in their own chapter in RPA. So we're doing a lot of this, that in a way that no one else has done before. So we're really excited about that. And I think there's a long way to go, but I think it's really cool to see some of these trends kind of together, as I'll show. So for fire and drought, we look at recent trends and future projections. For all the other disturbances we include, we have recent trends assembled only. So invasive plants, we look at insects and disease, and we look at forest removals or what you might call harvest trends. And we look at the conterminous US, We also look by region. There are the regions there. We have 4 regions. And then we also look at forest ecosystems. And then we also have some case studies where we don't have maybe national data on certain aspects of forests, or maybe a really new aspect of forest disturbance. We have some case studies included. So we have a case study of drought impacts actually from Texas, economic and ecological impacts. We also have a case study on prescribed fire and then sea level rise. And in the chapter, we primarily analyze exposure or trends in the forest disturbances themselves. And we talk a lot about how to tie those to potential impacts to the forest, or kind of threats and vulnerability. But in a lot of cases, we don't have results and we don't have data for how specific disturbances at this broad scale in a consistent way, how these disturbances impact the forest. So that's a place we're looking to kind of add to in the future, but that's just to say that the exposure is really the kind of place we're at in this chapter. So here I'm going to talk about fire and drought, where we have recent trends and future projections. And I said we only had recent trends for disease, but actually we have put together some new projections kind of since the RPA that aren't in the chapter for the North and South regions. So I'll show those as well. So I also want to point out in the disturbance chapter, we look at forest and rangelands, but here I'm just going to be focused on the forest piece. So I also wanted to say that we have a lot of different data sources that we're pulling from for this disturbance chapter. And they're pretty widely used data sets. And it just bears kind of showing what they are. So for recent fire trends, we used MTBS data, monitoring trends and burn severity data, which incorporates big fires, 405 hectares in the west and 202 hectares in the east. And we wanted to do that to capture the full record back to the early 1980s, where we didn't have other data sources that went back that far. For recent drought exposure and future drought exposure, we use a meteorological index. The recent drought is based on PRISM climate data, and the kind of future modeled drought is based on downscaled climate projections. And then I wanted to also say, so for future fire and for the disease results, forest disease results I'll show, they actually come from this forest dynamics model that was developed for the RPA, and it relies, and it's worth going into a little detail here because I'm going to show several results from it, as well as sort of some trends in the overall forest resource. So I want to talk about a little bit about how it works. So it relies on forest inventory and analysis data, or FIA. Some of you may have heard of, where the field crews basically visit sites and record data on everything from species composition, the basal area and volume measurements, and species identity of each tree in a plot. And they do this in a statistically representative way, so we can make estimates of the forest resource across all forest land in the U.S. And there are, over 140, I think, thousand plots that are visited regularly. So we have data through time, going back about 2 decades now. And we have a projection model that is focused on moving that FIA inventory forward in time. So it's basically producing future realizations of the FIA inventory. And we have drivers in that, such as land use change, forest regeneration, forest succession and maturing, climate, and global demand for wood and wood products. And then usually our disturbance projections that you'll see here are they're generally in terms of volume killed by disturbance, volume of trees killed. And so that's just a brief overview of some of the sources of data. In the RPA, we use scenarios, 4 scenarios that vary in terms of their future warming. On the y-axis there, you see we have a low and a high level of future warming we look at. And then we have 3 levels of, we kind of pair those with 3 levels of future socioeconomic growth in the US. And the US socioeconomic growth are actually come from projections of human population and income that are done within the RPA team. The RPA scenarios are linked with global scenarios from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so therefore they're developed by combining these RCPs, or representative concentration pathways, with shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. And then within each of these boxes, within each of these scenarios, we have 5 climate models we assess. So really it's a combination. We get about, I guess we get 20 futures that we're assessing. So we have a least warm, GCM, a hot, a dry, a wet, and a middle. So in most cases, we have 20 futures, and actually just wanted to point out that for drought, we're just looking at the alternative warming levels only, so the low and the high warming, and we don't have these repeat scenarios, the 3 socioeconomic growth scenarios. We have only 10 futures in that case, so just keep that in mind. But that's kind of the setup. So jumping into the kind of the results, again, we use MTBS data to look at past trends and fire, and so we overlaid that on forest locations. And we see that a general trend, this is for the conterminous US, is that average annual area burned from 2000 to 2017, so kind of to the right of this dotted line or dashed line, was more than double the pre-2000 average. So we're seeing an increase over time in the past in these results. And then that kind of same general trend is what we found in the 2 western regions, the Rocky Mountain and the Pacific Coast. Sort of general order of magnitude is the same, 219% increase in the Rockies and 165% increase in the Pacific Coast. We found increases in the north and the south, but there are far fewer kind of large fires in both of those regions. So it's a little harder to assess, but certainly in the western regions, we found increasing fires in the past area burned. Now for the future, we look at, we use results from the forest dynamics model, and we look at volume of trees killed by fire, and we see qualitatively similar trajectories kind of across the 20 futures we looked at. Now these panels are the 4 scenarios we use, the low and high warming, and the low, medium, and high socioeconomic levels. And so we see qualitatively similar trajectories across all of those. We see kind of more increase on the higher end under the hot and dry climate models. And then in the least warm model is kind of the lower end. But we see basically by 2070, between a 55 to 108% increase in tree mortality across the conterminous US by volume. And so indicating that, you know, under some of these futures, kind of at the high end, we see a doubling of trees killed by fire. I'll just note the secondary y-axis, which indicates the relative to the 2020 total live volume of forests in the US. And you know, this is an annual measure here is what we're modeling. But annually, you know, these numbers are relatively small in proportion to the total volume of the forest. But if you think about kind of sort of over time each year, this much being burned, it definitely adds up. Now breaking that down into the 4 regions that I showed, this is just taking those 2070 values and looking at 2020 here in the gray, and then 2070 values for all 4 of those scenarios in the colors. And the dots for the values in 2070, the dots represent the mean of the 5 RPA climate projections under each RPA scenario, and the vertical bars is the range of values. So we see an increase in total volume burned in all of these regions compared to 2020. You know, with the highest in 2070 being in the Rocky Mountain region and Pacific, but in a relative sense, the South seeing a pretty large increase in tree killed volumes or fire killed tree volumes by 2070. Now, I said we'd look at things mostly in terms of volume, but an increase in volume killed over time, the time period can come from an increase in overall area burned or increases in severity of fires or combinations. So we try to tease that apart and actually convert it to an area. Now, the FIA crews, the field crews that go out don't really do a good job of detecting low severity fires, but we can put a number on area of moderate and high severity fires. So we looked at those trends, and this has just changed in the 50-year period in moderate severity fires and high severity fires. In all regions, we saw an increase in the area of moderate severity fires by 2070. And in the South and Pacific Coast, high severities are projected to increase, while in the other regions, like Rocky Mountain, we get a negative or a positive trend depending on the scenario we looked at. And in the North, actually decrease in high severity fires. So in general, much of the increased volume actually is coming from an increase in moderate severity fires in each of these regions. Now, local trends may vary within each region, and you might be interested in those, and in that case, you would want to tease those out. But this is the regional picture again. We did look at some forest ecosystems and how fire mortality volume would change. These are just some of the top 8 forest ecosystems in the West where that had the most fire in the recent years, and just looking at how those would change. And we see an increase in almost all of these ecosystems and in the tree mortality from fire. And the only place where we see a decrease is actually in lodgepole pine, but actually in the forest dynamics projections overall, we see a slight decrease in lodgepole pine area expected. So that could be where some of the decrease there is coming from. But especially some of these forest type groups that some of you may be really familiar with, they usually have relatively low total live volumes in general and experience, frequent but low severity fires. And so, any increase in trees killed by a fire, we would want to know more about sort of the impacts. They could have some impacts on those ecosystems and be the types of fires those ecosystems are not adapted to. Now in the East, we see some increases as well, although there's less fire in these ecosystems. I will point out that oak hickory forests are expected to see an increase in tree mortality from fire. And that also may come from the fact that in the forest dynamics projections, oak hickory forests are expected to increase in area quite a bit, especially under the hot climate model, which is sort of at the high end there for the oak hickory forest. So just keep moving it along. Oh, Jeff, did you want to stop? This is kind of I guess it's a little more than halfway, but we could stop for a question.
Sure, Jen. I think that's a perfect idea. So we just have a couple questions, and this one is from Bill Copeland, and he asks, are the Southeast growth scenarios presented to project demand for wood products?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm going to show a slide about that later. But yes, and we do see the effect of the differences among the scenarios in the Southeast and then other places where kind of wood production is big. So yes, and the let's see, I'm going to forget. The two of the scenarios include increased demand for bioenergy, for example, and we see that signature kind of coming through and some of the effects on the modeled trends we project in the forests. So maybe I could speak to that a little bit more once I get to that slide. But yes, they do include that. And there's a harvest choice model that's embedded in the forest dynamics model that does drive the dynamics under demand scenarios. Yep.
Yeah, and Bill kind of added to that, socioeconomics in the Southeast, and I think you kind of covered that. And so I'll also ask about, you mentioned the lodgepole is expected, lodgepole pine is expected to have less impacts in the future projection. Do you think that's because it's had so many significant impacts due to kind of the synergy between drought, wildfire, and the mountain pine beetle? Is that, I mean, it seems like the most vulnerable ecosystem, but yet,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's definitely probable. I haven't looked specifically at that, but we are doing some kind of work with this forest dynamics model and looking at future fire on some subsets of lands in the West. And actually we're seeing that the signature of recent fires being high in some places, actually in the forest dynamics model, the future trends actually then drop off and become lower. So that's definitely true. Part of it, I think, also is the fact that we're projecting a decrease in lodgepole pine area, but I'd have to dig in to know kind of in a relative sense, which kind of specific drivers are sort of leading to the decrease that we're seeing in that case. But yeah, I think that's a good assumption to make.
Yeah, we'll let you get back to it, but it's just stunning to look at that difference between 1984, the period between 84 and 2000, and then look at 2000 to 2017, and then look at the projection. It's just doesn't seem sustainable, but I'll let you explain. I'll let you explain that. I do. So we'll catch the rest of the questions on the back end. Let you get rolling.
Okay. Yep. And I realize I do want to save time for questions. So I'll move ahead. So moving into drought, again, we used a meteorological drought index and looked at drought exposure. In this case, we used sort of these subregions, so smaller regions than the big 4 regions we were looking at for fire. You can see these panels kind of go west to east in the U.S. By region and look at 36-month SPEI, so 3-year drought, and overlaid that on forested locations. And we look at the proportion monthly exposed to these different levels of SPEI. So the blues being wet, the browns being dry, and they're just basically stacked bar graphs monthly through time. So these trends generally in these regions, I think, really reflect conditions that we know about historically. Back to the 1950s, there was widespread drought in the middle of the country, and we can see that in the Intermountain, the dark orange, the Great Plains, the South Central, South and North Central subregions, showing those big, heavy dark brown lines in the 1950s. And then in the 60s, across much of the North Central and Northeast region, we had pretty widespread drought that we know about. So those are just some examples. We are kind of seeing that these reflect known trends. And then starting in approximately 2000, kind of right before I have this dashed line, we see really a divergence in broad kind of drought regimes, if you will, across different regions. So the first few regions here in the most western areas really have had a lot of brown, have had a lot of drought, and that corresponds with a lot of other studies and what we know. And we're seeing this kind of, a lot of folks have called this mega drought, especially in the sort of Pacific states. 20 years really of drought conditions, kind of maybe off and on, but in general, basic constant exposure to drought, and the rest of the country being fairly wet relative to those regions. So I think that really illustrates the kind of complexities of the national drought regime that we've seen. I just want to move along pretty quickly here. We looked at the future drought. So we summarized the last 2 categories, the most extreme drought categories, and looked at the average monthly proportion of forest exposed to those drought categories, the most extreme, severe and extreme drought. So this is in the past. And then under those 10 climate scenarios, again, the low and high warming and the 5 GCMs. So the recent past, we had about 11% of this, on average, forest exposed to drought across the across the country and across all these scenarios. By mid-century, we see more than a tripling of monthly proportion of forest exposed to drought, so 38% on average. But it does vary across these scenarios. And again, we're talking about exposure to drought and not necessarily threat or vulnerability. And some forests are more sensitive than others to drought. But here we can get at least a picture of exposure. And so we stacked up all those 10 and looked at where does each of the 10 sort of outcomes project more than a tripling of monthly forest drought exposure. So where do we have highest confidence across the 10 outcomes or futures that we looked at? And so those yellows and light greens are where nearly all or all of the futures project a high level of drought exposure. And then we can look at which forest types are within those kind of places where the models agree on change in exposure. So this is where 8, 9, or 10 of the 10 agree that there'll be a high exposure in the future to drought. So we can see which forests do we have now. So we have a large area of that is pinyon juniper forests. We have woodland hardwoods, spruce fir, mountain hemlock, oak hickory forest, which is actually more of an eastern type, and then et cetera. So we can start to get a picture of, well, pinyon juniper we know has experienced drought and other disturbances and has had some severe sort of impacts from those disturbances. And so we can paint a picture of, well, okay, we know it's going to be in these places of high exposure in the future. We can start to kind of provide information for management, policy, et cetera, and perhaps more research needed to know what to do about future exposure to drought and how to help those forests be more resilient. I think I'll skip over this for time because it has a lot of the same messages, but there are these ecosystems. If we look at recent and then future potential exposure across the range of these ecosystems, we see some of these same ecosystems popping out as having potential for high exposure to drought. And then a real quick look at some projections we're just starting to put together, and again, weren't in the RPA. But this is forest disease mortality projections for the north and south regions. And so the black is the recent trend from RPA, just how much volume is killed by diseases within the FIA record up to right before 2020, and then what the model projects into the future for the north and then for the south. And we see that the recent trend has been quite an increase, and for the most part, kind of we see that trend continuing with some variation across the scenarios. I think also for the most part, there's not a whole lot of difference between climate models in this case, and I think that is because, and as we'll see in a little bit, the general dynamics of these regions in the forest dynamics model are projecting an increase in volume and an aging, in a lot of forest aging in a lot of cases, or forest succession. And so more diseases and older and more dense forests in these cases. So yeah, just really quick from some of the other RPA chapters to kind of put the disturbance results in context. A key message from the land resources chapter is that developed lands are projected to continue to expand in all scenarios by 2070. And the result of that, and so we can see here on the left for each region and each of those scenarios, we see more developed land in the future compared to 2020. And on the flip side, the result of that is loss of forests, and much of that loss is due to conversion to developed land. So we do project a loss across all regions and more in the south due to land use change. So just to kind of an additional change in the forest, aside from the disturbances, that land conversion. And then, as I referred to a little bit, live volume is actually projected to increase across the US as a whole. Now it does vary by scenario. These 4 panels are those scenarios, and then we see the climate models within those. And speaking of the forest product demand, the low, moderate, the kind of upper left, and then the lower right panel, the high scenario, actually include quite an increase in demand for bioenergy. And so that's kind of driving a lot of the kind of slower increase and then sort of dropping off by the end of the projection period in the live volumes in those scenarios. And if we look at that by region, just to quickly, because we had that question, especially about the South. Again, this is now changed to the colors represent the scenarios, and that's just the mean across the climate models in this case. But we do see, like, for example, in the South, the volume increasing in those scenarios that don't have the increased bioenergy demand, but the two that do, the volumes drop off quite a bit in the South, and that's less pronounced in the other regions. Now in the Rocky Mountains, I think this is where we're seeing more the signature of disturbance. We see actually a decrease in the total live volumes in that region. And just another result on age, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the volumes. The black bars are the 2020 kind of age distribution, and then those are paired in each kind of age class with the 2070 numbers for the different scenarios. So we see in the East kind of a shifting to the right of the age distribution. So a lot of forests getting older, and this is a signature, I think, of kind of forest abandonment, perhaps around the 2020 or 1920s and 1930s, kind of the Depression, where a lot of forests in the East have regenerated from that time, and now we're seeing them kind of move through succession. We do see a lot of earlier age classes as well, meaning in places where there's been a stand replacing disturbance. But overall, one of the main signatures is this aging. And same in the West, I think we're seeing, this shift to managing more older forests. And so we do see an increase in the older age class in the West being forecasted or projected by 2070. And I'll just keep going here. I know I want to save some time for questions, but just to say we are seeing changes for projected increases in disturbance. And I think that we're looking at these broad trends, but I think the real effects, as we saw in the first few slides, are potentially on some of the ecological integrity and the functioning and ecosystem services that are likely to be affected, which we did not get into in real detail, especially in a quantitative way in this RPA chapter, and they may be more local. I think we need some further work both on the disturbance trends assessment and in the sort of forest dynamics model to understand and characterize and summarize more aspects of the effects on the forest that really matter. And I think it's just hard to characterize some of these extreme events that we're just now beginning to observe and then to model them and their effects into the future, because there is so much uncertainty about their effects, and they're just so rare right now that we don't have a lot of data. So I think we have a lot of work to do on that, and I'll skip ahead just to say a couple things about I wanted to wrap up and kind of talk about some further implications. And so I think what a lot of this webinar series this year is going to really focus on is some of the management, or at least some of the webinars are. So that's awesome. And my just general thoughts is that I think it's really important to understand these broad trends in order to kind of set the stage and provide a broad picture, and to learn what we can now, even if it's incomplete, about how disturbances are likely to change in the future, to really help set the stage for proactive management. I think in a lot of forest ecosystems, there's mounting evidence that forest thinning or prescribed fire, or both in combination, can really have an effect, but they have to be done prior to the disturbance. They can ameliorate mortality and so help forests be more resilient to disturbances. But we need more consistent broad scale studies on the management and a kind of comprehensive framework, which we don't yet have, but I think that is a real promising area. We have, of course, new disturbances like sea level rise, which I won't talk about, but we do mention in the disturbance chapter. And then the same disturbances like southern pine beetle actually occurring in new places, which can present novel challenges for management. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And then of course, humans, people living in the WUI and the wildland urban interface, which is just increasing. And so it's, obviously risks to human life and property, but also real complexities and challenges for management in the future. And I think as land use changes, as population grows, we're sure to see more of that. So just some final thoughts. Disturbances, as I said, are part of the natural dynamics of forests. And in our 2020 RPA, we are seeing increasing signatures of disturbance, both in the past and then in the projections we have. We definitely see potential for future increases. And I think we'll be really critical to dig in more on these effects on ecological integrity, species composition, functioning, ecosystem services, because they're sure to have an effect on them, and understanding those at broad scales as well will be critical. And then, yeah, there's new challenges and these changing dynamics. So future work, we really aim to get a better picture, not only of the trends of the disturbances, but of their impacts, and then hopefully lead to kind of maximized actionable information for policy management and conservation of forests. So thank you. I hope we have at least a few minutes for questions. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jen. That was great. And it is really great that there is a disturbance chapter now in the RPA. So now, now we'll have the data, that we can look back on. And so, and really the first questions I'm going to give you are, kind of related to that. It's going to be whether you can answer these, or really whether you have the data to answer them. And these two questions are both, this is, I think, the same question, but they're stated really well in both cases. So I'm going to read both. This is from Kevin Labram, and he says, area burned and fire increased, but is it within or outside the natural range of variation for fires? And then he goes on to say, how do the projected changes in the amount of fire compared to the amounts of fires or undisturbed operating under natural disturbance regimes? So, and then Brenda McComb also, it's a similar question. I'm going to read it again because I think it's the same question, just also stated very well. We know that many of these ecosystems are carrying more volume than historic, as fire was removed from the system following colonization. To what degree are these forests resetting to historic conditions versus seeing additive impacts to historic conditions?
Yeah,
Right.
I think those are great questions. And that's sort of what, on one side of the coin, I'll answer that by saying we did try to at least speak to that. So, I think the slides I showed where we did do the assessment by forest type, forest ecosystem type, and look at, across the board, almost all systems were expected to have increases in fire. And really we're able to speak to, in broad brushstrokes, well, if ponderosa pine forests see an increase in volume killed by fire, that might indicate more fire, which might be good in some places. But if it's volume killed and an increase in high severity fire, that can be indicative of, outside the sort of natural disturbance regime, which a lot of those places may have been, fairly frequent low severity fires. So I think those are exactly the kinds of statements we want to make in a more quantitative way, and we have tried to make in a sort of qualitative ways. But yeah, it's really challenging to kind of have comprehensive data on those sort of effects, and I think it's going to be easier and easier. The FIA data we do have are now getting to be 20 plus years of this annual survey of FIA. So it's actually a consistent method over time, and we can start looking at change over time in the past, and that can help us understand what might happen in the future. But yeah, we haven't at this sort of these broad scales, and at least for this initial RPA effort, we weren't able to put those together in a quantitative way. But I totally agree. I mean, yes, I've done a lot of disturbance kind of ecology in my life, and I think the sort of natural range of variability and the sort of understanding in the context of expected disturbance regimes is really important. But so yeah, thanks for the questions.
Yeah, they were good questions. Okay, so this one is from Shannon, and this is about drought, and she's really asking about the kind of the baseline. Does the baseline from which drought is measured change? When is it no longer drought and the new baseline? And so I guess that's looking at it over time and just.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in our work, we left the baseline, we call it the reference period for kind of parameterizing the SPI index. We left that constant at 1950 to 2005, partly for a data reason, and I could go into that, but it's mostly to get this kind of fairly long-term historical picture. I know of some, emerging literature that says in some systems we might want to consider a shifting baseline because some ecosystems might be adapting to dry conditions, and it's actually, you might need a reference that kind of changes over time. And yeah, maybe the future becomes the norm. We thought with most of these forest ecosystems, since the trees are relatively long-lived, their ages can vary, but still they're kind of established, and then it's not like forest trees, at least, are moving over time. Now things like wildlife, birds, etc., fairly, agile and mobile organisms, you might take a different tack. But for these systems we were looking at, we actually thought it was pretty informative to keep the historical baseline and kind of look at when a lot of these forests might have established and then changing conditions and compared with that. But I do agree that that could be another way to look at it, and it's definitely important.
All right, and so Troy Thompson asked a question that I'm sure is in the mind of a number of folks on the eastern side of the Mississippi, and that is, eastern hardwood forests have been referred to as the asbestos forest due to their resistance to fire or seeming resistance. But your data seems to suggest that increasing drought and disease will likely push those forests beyond their ability to resist fire in many places. Is that a fair assessment? Is that truly what the data is saying?
Yeah, I don't know that we can. So I think generally the data, I'm comfortable with saying that the data suggest more exposure to those disturbances. And yes, we do see, in the forest dynamics model, or with the forest dynamics model, we are projecting, increases in fire killed volumes of trees. So yes, more trees dying, but I guess it remains to be seen sort of the long-term resilience to that. And I guess I would also say that I'm aware of at least one paper that kind of, sort of takes a look at, these sort of oak dominated systems in the East. And yes, they're sort of purported to be drought resistant, for example, but that may or may not be the case in the future as climate changes, as these droughts, you not only are going to get potentially just drier, just less precipitation, but actually, higher thirst of the atmosphere or higher like vapor pressure deficits. And kind of that goes hand in hand with, warmer, hotter temperatures. And so their resistance to these disturbances might change in a fundamental way. But definitely we're not incorporating that. And I think sort of the broader scientific knowledge on that is still evolving. But yeah, that could be the case.
Okay, and again, it's about 4 minutes after, but I have two more questions. I'm going to let you try to just answer quickly, and one is from Bill Copeland, and he mentions calcium deficits have been identified as an emerging problem for fresh waters. Considering that calcium is critical for plant disease resistance and growth, could this be a problem for forests as well? Calcium loss via, and he parenthetically, calcium loss via acid rain and repeated harvest.
Yeah, I don't know. I am not an expert on that. I will say, I know that acid rain has decreased. Harvests are, we do project some increases in harvest in the forest chapter of the RPA, which I didn't show, but I don't know about the tide with calcium, so I don't know. But yeah, encourage others who might know to put info on that in the chat.
All right, and I think you may have said this. So first of all, there was a question, and again, I'm not sure where this was. Hang on a second. No, this was just a request, and that was to flip back to the last slide, although I don't know exactly where you were when she said that. But can you flip back just one slide? Maybe you had your concluding remarks on the previous slide.
Oh, yeah, that's probably a good place
Maybe.
to keep it.
So I don't know. It was good to have the. So I'll just ask this last question, and that is for the next. I'm sure you'll be around for the next assessment and get to manage this chapter again. So what other disturbances are you going to include?
So yeah, so I'd mentioned we have a sidebar in this current chapter on sea level rise, and I think that's going to be not just a sidebar, but more of a focus along with the others in the future. I think it's an important disturbance in and of itself in terms of its impacts, direct impacts, and the impacts kind of with saltwater intrusion on the ecosystems on the coast. But also we see potential for like interactions with land use and potential if there are widespread mortality of forests due to sea level rise, how that might change the ability of forests to provide wood products. And if houses are damaged or destroyed and people need to move inland, there might be more demand for wood products in the future. And so those types of interactions I think will be really cool to explore in more detail and more quantitative way in the future. From sea level rise, we're also we're also starting work on hurricanes and other major storms and how they may affect forests in the future. And so those would definitely be in the next RPA or plan to be.
Great. So there are lots of thank you, Jens, and superlatives in the chat. So, and again, so thanks so much for joining us. It was a great presentation, really chock full of information. So, Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us and really getting us, along our way for our series. And good luck, as the assessment rolls out and people are really looking at the data and hopefully adding to that. So. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
And thanks to the audience, for joining us on Halloween.